Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Philip Nelson.
Dr. Peter Weinstein, how are you doing? I want to introduce you to our 12 followers that I think are listening to us. And I'm Phil Nelson. I've missed my friend Peter. I have a lot of pent-up emotion to talk about, but I understand he does too. Let me start out by thanking Nationwide for supporting us and supporting our podcast. I also want to thank Nicole Nelson for being our producer and cleaning up our mess when we get a little too excited about things that are going on. There's a lot happening in the world, Peter. So first of all, tell me how you're doing, and then tell me, what are you worried about or want to talk about in this conversation?
Right now, my feeling is that of being uncomfortable. I feel that the foundation upon which we have lived for the last 200 plus years, but is just really under scrutiny, under attack. And I'm just concerned about a lot of the stuff we've talked about for the last 4 years. I don't think it's anything new. It just seems like the news cycles are moving so fast, and the information that's coming out is coming out fast and furious that you barely have time to digest it before something else occurs. And in the last 2-3 weeks, oh man, I've got a headache just trying to keep up with fact and fallacy and you know what is going on, what's the future look like. I'm just uncomfortable. That's kind of where I am at the moment, and it's kind of started in and around the beginning of July, and episodes of things that were going on that have impacted the political system in the United States. That's where my discomfort is coming from.
So tell me what the defining incident was that began this discomfort in July.
I got to say that I think it was July 14th in Butler, Pennsylvania, when there was an assassination attempt at one of the political candidates during a rally. And I lived through JFK, and I never thought, and Ronald Reagan. There was no K in Ronald's name, so I don't know what to do with that. And I never thought we would continue to have these political attacks. It was interesting because I was going back and reading about Gabby Giffords, who was the House of Representatives individual from Arizona who had an assassination attempt. I guess maybe you put blockers on and you don't remember all of these things, but I think it was that level of concern that we are still living in an environment where even our politicians aren't safe.
So I need you to help me here. I lived through the same period, and saw the same heroes and dignitaries fall, or the attempts on their lives. I'm trying to figure out, though, why people thought it suddenly was no longer option. We have a lot more guns than we used to have, even though we may have passed a few more laws since then. It's my opinion, it's a lot easier to get them now than it was then. And they're a lot more dangerous than they were then. And in many cases, although if the fallen hero happened to be, for those who considered the fallen a hero, it was interpreted as a expression of the anger from the other side. But in reality, in many of these cases, these were lone wolves that got a gun and happened to be on one side or the other and became a reflection of that side. So I don't understand what changed between Ronald Reagan's assassination and assassination attempt, and now that we would think that it wouldn't happen again.
I guess in my jaded brain, the security and the knowledge and the oversight of our governmental agencies is so molecular that they know what you had for breakfast and what color your poop was. So it's that sort of level of oversight that made me feel that we were better aware of those potential candidates for assassinations, not the targets, but the ones who might. So I think
I know,
part of it was that the
yeah, I
candidates.
hear you. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So it's really more of an awareness of the governmental agencies who are responsible for protecting our.
And so you had an unusual trust in our security system at a time, by the way, that the security system has been overtaxed in terms of, think about just covering. Well, first of all, they were overtaxed because especially the Secret Service is overtaxed by the number of presidents that are alive today, their families, the sizes of those families. Trump and Trump's family alone requires as much coverage as Obama and Bush and Carter put together. I don't think and then they still have to worry about Biden and Kamala and all the other vice presidents. And yet there has not been a significant increase in funding for Secret Service. And so it doesn't take a very sharp manager to recognize that there have to be holes in place in there, that there have to be vacuums of coverage. And to your statement that they are so good that we haven't had anything yet, that they've foiled everything up to this point, is a compliment to the Secret Service. At the same time, there has been more of a subtle states' rights movement, that part of that protection, part of that system depends on cooperation between Secret Service and local police. And I submit that if there were ever a time that we would figure out, that we would discover separate it, and when local, and there may be local agencies that bristle when federal agencies come in to try to take control of these kind of mechanisms, which creates even more holes. It is ironic that the person that I think led this charge was the target of such an assassination attempt. I don't think it was. But the changes that I already mentioned. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, the event of July was the first of a series of events that were political in nature, in terms of that event led into the Republican National Convention. That event led into a lot of stress and strife on the Democratic Party that ultimately led to the number one candidate for the Democratic Party decision not to continue his efforts to run for president, led to the support for a new presidential candidate on the Democratic side, and then all of the consternation that is surrounding all of this that is going on concurrently. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose. That's my point, is that this is so much going on, and it's becoming harder and harder to separate fact from fiction.
Well, I don't know about that last statement. I haven't seen I don't think it has been any harder to separate fact from fiction recently than it was a year ago. I just think we've had a lot of developments occur in succession more frequently, but the challenge of celebrating fact from fiction hasn't gotten any more difficult than it was a year ago to me.
You had more time to separate it out. It's just been so intense in the last 2 weeks.
Good point. I accept that. Yeah, from that perspective, you're right. But the big issues don't need to be separated out. President Biden has pulled out of the race. We have a new candidate, and now we have to reset and decide. Now, for me, there's no resetting. One candidate is just not acceptable for me. They have made their choice, and their choice may be made out of a negative choice. There's no way I can vote for a man who does not believe in the electoral process. There is no way I can and will not accept the results of that process if he does not win. There's no way I can vote for a man who has been found guilty, not of tax evasion. There's no way I can vote for a man who is found guilty for rape, and who is under indictment for even worse things. So that's just an area that I can't cross. As far as I'm concerned, the wrong person got out of the race, you know, to make this a race. But I hear you. I understand what you're saying. Dr. Weinstein, as citizen number one, what do you suggest we do about this, about your angst and your confusion and your quest for conscious peace?
Well, I think part of it is the last 11 or 12 minutes is just having these conversations, because there's a bias in my house we all talk about because we believe in the same thing. I try to stay off of social media, because there's a lot of vacuous opinions, you know, people speaking from orifices that have nothing but flatulence in them. And for those of you who disagree with that statement, my apologies. But even watching the news, it's harder and harder. Maybe I shouldn't say news, because you know what I feel about the networks right now. Watching the entertainment pretending to be news, it's really difficult. I do think Kamala Harris is an excellent individual. I think she presents herself well. I think that it is great to see the coming together of the Democratic Party behind her in their efforts to move her forward as the candidate to represent the Democrats in the fall election. I worry about ramifications of the ultimate election if they either direction, with quotes such as, well, if you vote me in, you won't have to vote again in the next 4 years from now, which is a quote that came out of a speech. All of this just adds to this level of angst that, you know, just makes it uncomfortable. I almost want to bury myself in work, because by doing so, I can hopefully ignore some of the noise that we're being bombarded with. And we are being bombarded with noise. It's trying to figure out what is the music and what is the noise.
So, you know, we just finished a previous conversation a bit back where I was the one that was dismayed and bewildered. I think we both came to feel the same way. I'm just surprised at the differences in stimulus and the stimulus that caused it. I was already in your haze because of the SCOTUS decision on immunity. And so when all of this, and to be honest, I was in a political hiatus as a result of that, when the rest of these events occurred. And as a result, they didn't affect me as much because I had already withdrawn and was able to just assimilate it without emotion, because I would not allow myself to feel emotion. I didn't watch the news for at least 2 weeks.
Oh my God. You didn't watch the news for 2 weeks?
I did not.
Were you in a drug-induced coma?
I was in a depression.
Okay. You didn't call me. My fee would have gone up.
Whether it was drug-induced or not, it was depression. It was total disbelief. But I needed more than a vacation. I needed more than a break. I needed to divorce myself from the situation. And I'm admitting this to you to say, as much as I'm questioning you and testing you, etc., it's not as if I don't understand. But I was not overtaken by the frequency of the turn of events that occurred, you know, with an assassination attempt, with a total change in candidacy, with a new campaign. And as I said, I didn't have the added problem of trying to decide who would I want now.
It intrigues me, and maybe it's just me, but it intrigues me, the emotional response to the Supreme Court decision was impacted you to the level that it did. And I don't know of a lot of others who responded to it in the same way.
I don't either. But I saw it as an attack on the primary root of democracy. And I saw a potentially fatal cut on that root.
It's interesting that you say that, because there are others who would suggest that the last 2 weeks probably felt an attack on democracy in all sorts of different ways because of the different events that were going on. So I think it's just interesting to watch how different people, perspective.
But you see, and again, in my attempt to rationalize here, I don't mean to demean the importance of any of these instances. I want to make sure that's clear. We've had assassinations before and survived them. We've had assassination attempts before and survived them. We have had changes in candidates in the middle of their campaigns and survived them. The individuals are not what matters. It's the principles that matter. And we are trying to find individuals that represent the greatest array of principles that we believe in as individual citizens. And so I'm not as threatened by those changes when it comes to the roots and principles of this country.
So here's
now, but that just happened to be, I just happen to focus or try to focus. I happen to be an individual who tries to focus on the higher purpose and the higher, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, that's exactly where I was going. The average voting citizen can wrap their arms around a person, but can't touch a principle.
Right.
Which makes it much easier for those of us who are not as highfalutin as you are to look at the events that have touched people individually as being more distressing and discomforting than events that have impacted principles. Principles, you're absolutely correct, have long-term ramifications and may be undoable, unreversible. But people are much easier to touch and to respond to. And I think that's what I've focused on more, is just the tangible news that is minute by minute, not looking at the long-term ramifications, not to recognize the fact that whomever we choose in November to be president will have some huge ramifications, huge challenges. Oh, and by the way, who gets seated in the House of Representatives will have a huge impact on the ability of whomever is elected president. Oh, and by the way, whomever is elected to the Senate will have a huge impact. But they are all people, and we're voting for people because we just don't seem to vote for principles anymore.
Well, even if we vote for principles, we have to vote for people.
Right.
Right? But it's the principles, but we're voting for the people that represent our principles. My problem is that it is becoming rarer and rarer to find candidates who discuss their principles or who run on principles. I find more candidates who run on shoddy, superficial presentations. People who are against childless cat ladies, or people who are against the ability for a woman who might live in a state that restricts abortion to move to a state to have one. And then because they would have to get on a bus with predominantly Black people in order to get an abortion. These are superficial issues, important though they may be, that are not based on principle. It is based on prejudice and bias.
You remember when the conventions started out with platforms and planks?
Yes.
That the representatives voted for?
Yes.
Give guidelines to the political candidates and to the Senate and House candidates as to this is what we believe, the principles that we believe in.
And now we have a party where one man can actually pull a plank.
It is interesting how we have.
That's a principle I can't abide by.
Yeah, it is interesting that we have moved away from. I think a lot of it has to do with news and social media. It's about how people present themselves, not about the principles upon which they will lead.
Well, I don't know if it is the problem in social media or if the problem is we have become less analytical ourselves. I blame the citizenry for falling into the trap of personality, of looking at people who, we all want people who speak, but we want, and I also reject not that I was insulted, but I also reject your characterization of me being highfalutin because I consider principles. I believe that every parent thinks they're trying to raise their child on principles. I believe religion is supposedly based on principles, but I have seen human beings recently ignore all of that, both in how they're raising their children and in how they practice their religion, in that they publicly scorn loving their neighbor as thyself. They publicly act to the contrary, being of service to their fellow man. They publicly uh, uh, exhibit behavior that causes their children to question what truth is. When there is no evidence that the 2020 election was stolen, and yet you can't become a Republican candidate unless you're willing to say that the 2020 election was stolen, then that is contrary to the principle of you should not lie.
You're heading to a discussion that we have probably avoided, which is that of autocracy, and probably not a discussion for today, but it's about, Game of Thrones, Kiss the Ring, Kneel, whatever it is from that standpoint. But that's really what you're talking about when you're talking about choosing people versus principles. There are those who believe that they only want to surround themselves with those who are willing to kiss the ring or bend the knee. And then there are others who are looking to be supported for the principles that they believe in.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that we've ignored it. I think we have discussed the danger of autocracy in past conversations. And this is just another layer of how we might and how you may find yourself there without intending to be there, especially if you think you can trust the personality that you are investing in.
So, Phil, you and I have had two conversations recently that have both been associated with our own levels of anxiety. And we're 100 days or so from an election. It's going to be an interesting ride. I will be there to make you more and more uncomfortable over the next few months.
I'll be doing the same thing, my friend.
Yeah, I know. I don't have to worry about that. You don't have to say that. I expect that. But I do think what we want to do, and it goes back to the quote we read at the beginning of the last conversation, which is we want to make others uncomfortable enough to have a conversation, to collect appropriate knowledge, not information, but knowledge to choose from, and to focus on principles and platforms and planks and not propaganda, really. And, the best conversation to have is with somebody who makes you uncomfortable. So thank you, Phil, for making me uncomfortable.
I would say that the best conversation is to be willing to go wherever the conversation goes and then pull out those nuggets of gold where you find common ground. And honestly, Peter is right. The best start for those conversations is when you start with what you disagree with, or that you might disagree with. If you start with the controversial and honestly listen, I think you'd be surprised at how close you really are. And I think you'd be surprised at how minor the differences really are and how minor the effect of those differences could be if we were more rational about those differences. I happen to work in higher ed, and I've noticed that higher ed is at times is somewhat like Congress, where the value of the problem, if there is a conflict, the value of that conflict is usually the more minimal the value of the conflict, the greater the conflict. And we need to be able to measure the importance of our disagreement better.
So I want to give one clue and cue to help our listeners. And you may or may not have noticed what Phil and I do to each other, at least in public. We ask questions, and then we take the time. Sometimes it's a long time when Phil's answering, but we take the time to listen for the answers. So I challenge each and every one of you. Phil's laughing. I challenge each and every one of you to ask good questions and then take the time to listen. You got to retort.
Well, I think this brings us to an end for this conversation. I have been insulted enough by my friend. No, I'm just kidding. I'm sure he's not through yet, but
I'm sure I'm through today. I got my jibes in. So
yeah, I bet you have. We want to thank our listeners for taking the time to join us on these rides and in these conversations. We ask that you seriously consider reaching out to those that you've always wanted to talk to, that you've always wanted to test their thoughts while you were testing yours. We believe that this is how we can knit our nation back together. we are concerned about the status of the national conversation. The national conversation does not occur from a microphone on a stage. The national conversation occurs in the audience with people you may or may not know. And it may start with, why are you here? In order to kick it off. But whatever it is, thank you for at least having the interest and the patience to listen to us. We want to thank Nationwide. And once again, we want to thank Nicole for cleaning this mess up. And Peter, it's been a pleasure.
2 words to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another courageous conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.